Stanford, which in some ways has probably militated against his greater reputation as a composer, is the fact that he was himself the teacher of an extraordinary catalogue of composers from who dominated, I think, the first half of the 20th century in Britain, and to some extent also in Ireland as well. Here we see a picture of the young Stanford about the age when he was appointed as Professor of Music at the Royal College. This is the Scottish baronial building, which the college moved into in the 1890s. Was not the original building, which you would have seen in my previous lecture. And it was here that Stanford had his famous room where he taught all his pupils, and we're talking about a catalogue of names that stretches from 1883 until his retirement around about 1921. So we're talking almost about 40 years of successful composition teaching. Now, one of the things that Stanford brought to composition teaching, I think, at the Royal College of Music, and which I think made him the person that so many people wanted to study with, was one that he expected extremely high standards. I mean, he was quite an irascible Irishman. He was quite argumentative. He had no time for second-rate work, and he could be pretty blunt and withering to his students if they brought him bad work. I mean, there's the story of Harold Samuel, who brought a cello sonata to him, and he listened to this piece played by Samuel and his cellist friend, and as they walked out of the college and past an undertaker's, he told Samuel that would be the best place for it. This was Stanford at probably his most blunt, but he made no allowances for his students at all. And if you couldn't do the work, you had to go back, study, and bring back something better. But one of the things that I think, in addition to this high standards that he expected, was the fact that he also wanted to bring a kind of practical dimension to composers. He didn't want the composition just to be notes on the page. Stanford himself, after all, was a very capable practical musician himself, pianist, organist. He'd played the violin in Dublin as well as a young boy. But he was also a conductor, quite a well-known conductor, not only of his own works, but of composers like Brahms, Schumann, and Beethoven, and so on. And I think he wanted students to hear what they composed. And he often used the Royal College Orchestra as a sort of guinea pig for his students, not only to hear their music, but also to direct it, which was often quite an ordeal for them. And I think this was primarily different from the experiences he'd had in Leipzig as a student back in the early 1870s. There, I think it was really just composition on paper, almost like exercises that he would produce for Reinecke. But at the college, he wanted something different. And he did the same thing when he was Professor of Music at Cambridge as well. He would, in fact, get funding from the university to bring up professional players from London to perform works, and he would lecture about the works that were being performed at the same time. There was this strong interaction, if you like, between musica theoretica and musica pratica. And I think that was really, really important. And I think this undoubtedly made him an attractive teacher. He was able to spot problems in composition and how to actually rectify them. And I think this is always a challenging thing in creative arts. How do you make something that is obviously very close to the creator better? And he had his famous gold propelling pencil that he would pull out of his top pocket, and he would say to a young pupil, here's the problem, my boy, which we always used to say with this Dublin brogue. There's the problem, and he put a line through it, and of course that would create, the first thing was a wince from the pupil who'd given their all to write this, sweated blood and tears, only to see this line go through the first sort of system or something. And he'd write a series of progressions. And inevitably, in almost in all situations, students would admit that it always improved what he saw there. I mean, Gustav Holst said, I believe, when after Stanford's memorial service at Westminster Abbey in 1924, we've lost somebody who just always knew how to put things right. And I think this was the respect that Stanford had as a teacher. Now, of course, when he was appointed at the Royal College of Music in 1882, the head or the director of the college was Sir George Grove. You can see there on the right. George Grove wasn't actually a musician. He'd spent most of his time he was a geographer, he was an administrator. He was also, though, very keen on music and did much to help promote the Crystal Palace concerts in the middle of the 19th century. And it was really through the Prince Consort and eventually the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, that the idea of the Royal College of Music came about in 1882. On the left, you can see his great contemporary, Hubert Parry, who eventually became Grove's successor in 1895 at the college. I think there was probably always a little tension between Stanford and Parry, because Stanford also put in for the directorship, but it was Parry whom they all wanted. But there's no doubt that in the early years, Parry and Stanford also got on extremely well together, helping, I think, to promote each other's works, and Stanford in particular conducting quite a lot of Parry's music in London and in Cambridge. I've got a photograph here of one of Stanford's very first pupils at the Royal College of Music in 1883, and this is another Irishman. This is Charles Wood, an Ulsterman. He was born in Armagh. His father was a choral vicar in the cathedral choir there. And it was Charles Wood, a prodigious student, who won the first Morley Scholarship in composition to the Royal College. And I mean, I think Stanford struck gold almost immediately with Wood. He was technically extraordinarily brilliant. He later became a teacher of counterpoint at the Royal College of Music in the 1880s. And he also became a colleague of Stanford's at Cambridge as well. Wood was at Gonville and Caius, Cambridge, where he was made a fellow in 1894. And Wood was himself an inveterate composer of string quartets. He wrote no less than, I think, 8 quartets, which are also rather neglected, but very fine. So, I mean, Wood, I think, was probably one of Stanford's first brilliant students. And it was Wood who succeeded Stanford for a very short time in 1924 as professor of music at Cambridge, though he died of cancer in 1926, only spending 2 years in the office. But they shared many things. They were both great composers of church music, which of course Stanford is still extremely well known for as a composer. So, I mean, the period of Wood study went on until about 1888, 1889 at the college. Not long after that, we had 2 arrivals. I suppose you might call these the boys from Croydon. And on the left, you can see Samuel Coleridge Taylor, he had a Sierra Leonean father, who went back to Sierra Leone and Africa as a practicing doctor before Samuel was born. And on the right, you have William Yates Hellstone. I would probably, they were both exceptionally gifted men. Probably I would say Hellstone had the edge. But there's no doubt that actually Coleridge Taylor enjoyed the greater fame. I mean, Coleridge Taylor came to Stanford at the age of around 14, 15. He was studying the violin and the piano, but also showed this talent for composition. And Hellstone was a little bit older, but they were there really in the early to mid 1890s. Now, Coleridge Taylor, not only was he interested, of course, in Brahms and Schumann, which would have been very much the examples, the models, the exemplars of Stanford, but he also composed chamber music. And again, during the course of this weekend's programs, we shall hear Coleridge Taylor's Quintet, which again he rates, it's only his opus 10 in F sharp. When Stanford saw the final product of this work, he said to Coleridge Taylor, "Well, my boy, you've done it." It is an extraordinary piece. It still it receives quite a lot of performances still, and it's incredibly well conceived for the clarinet and the string quartet in terms of scoring. It's beautifully composed in terms of its musical structures, and of course it's also very much this pentatonic thematic material, which I think maybe Coleridge Taylor had learnt from the examples of Antonin Dvorak, who was very much in vogue at this time in London. A good deal of Coleridge Taylor's music reflects, I think, Dvorak's influence. Well, this dates from 1895. I mean, Coleridge Taylor was so young, and I know that he made all these overtures to Joachim in Berlin. You must hear this young man's music. This is, he has a voice all of his own. He was also, of course, promoting the string quartets of Charles Wood to Joseph Joachim as well. Now, besides the clarinet and string quartet, you can see there, probably Coleridge Taylor's greatest triumph can be measured in his production of Hiawatha's Wedding Feast, which you can see on the left there, which dates from 1898. This was really towards the end of Coleridge Taylor's career as a student. And in fact, the very first performance took place at the Royal College in that year under Stanford's baton. So Stanford was still doing a great deal to promote this young pupil. Now, I suppose it's difficult to underestimate the sheer triumph of the first performance. I mean, not only did we have Parry and Stanford there at the college, but Edward Elgar, who was just about to sort of hit the headlines in 1899 with the Enigma Variations. We had Sir Arthur Sullivan, of course, famous for his Savoy operas and so on, all greatly admiring this work. And what Coleridge Taylor did was to take Longfellow, the American poet's poetry, and not produce this cantata in 1898. Highly exotic piece, really, looking at the culture of the American in this very much through a sort of romanticized spectrum, one might say. But so popular did it become very rapidly that he composed two other cantatas, The Death of Minnehaha and Hiawatha's Departure. And this formed a sort of triptych, a trilogy, which was often performed together. And indeed, it continued to be popular well into the 1930s. I mean, Sir Malcolm Sargent did a large number of performances with massive choirs and orchestras, and in costume, what's more, and also with, genuine running water fountains and so on. Many of these at the Crystal Palace before it burnt down. So Coleridge Taylor was hugely popular. But he died rather prematurely in 1912. largely, I think, through pneumonia brought on by exhaustion and overwork. And Stanford couldn't believe this when his death was announced, because he said, well, why did Coleridge Taylor effectively die in virtual penury when, given the importance, the popularity of Hiawatha's Wedding Feast, and indeed the trilogy of cantatas, he should have died a rich man, or at least a well-off man. And it turned out that Coleridge Taylor was so flattered, I think, by the fact that as a young man, Novello had offered him a contract to publish this work, that he received a fee for its publication, indeed a fee for the other works as well. And Stanford said, well, look, you know, if he'd received a royalty for every copy that he sold, then he would have been a lot better off. And he wrote to the Times, as was often Stanford's wont. You know, he was quite vociferous in his opinions, and these were often voiced in the Times and other music journals. And he asked Novello, you know, whether they had actually offered Coleridge Taylor a royalty. And while Novello were happy to say they'd done everything legally, Stanford wasn't convinced. Was a royalty offered to the young composer? And at that point, Novello demurred. But this was, I think, an indication very much that Stanford was a huge supporter of his students, Coleridge Taylor among them. William Yates' Hellstone is also a rather sad story. And again, another brilliant composer of chamber works. Cello sonata, there's violin sonata, there's a quintet for wind and piano, and so on, and it goes on. And in fact, probably his masterpiece is the Fantasy Quartet, which he wrote for the Cobbett Prize in 1905. And I think it's probably one of his most experimental pieces. And it's rather extraordinary the way it actually quotes one of the greatest fantasy pieces of the 19th century, the Liszt B minor sonata within its pages. I think, you know, he was very good at making these deft paraphrases and quips within his music. But Hellstone was, again, a brilliant student. In 1893, at the age of only 19, he appeared as pianist in his own piano concerto, a magnificent work, by the way, under Stanford's baton at the Royal College of Music. And there is, I think, still one extant recording, old recording of this work, but it really is amongst some of the most brilliant late 19th century romantic piano concertos, and deserves to be better known. He produced some very fine orchestral works in the late 19th, early 20th century as well, but always suffered, I think, he suffered from respiratory problems. And at the age of only 29, he died in 1906 and was greatly mourned by all his friends and teachers and colleagues. And perhaps, you know, I think brought to an end a really very, very promising career. Now, if you imagine these two boys from Croydon, they were joined not so very much later by these two young men. Their faces may be more familiar to you. On the left, we have Ralph Vaughan Williams, who arrived at the Royal College in 1892, and not long after that by Gustav Holst. You can see they're on the right. They were part of a kind of coterie of composers, and they always apparently used to sing the phrase from Brahms' Fourth Symphony when they went off to their coffee house to discuss music. The coffee house was called Wilkins, and they used to sing the scherzo from Brahms. Shall we go to Wilkins? Shall we go to Wilkins? Yes. And this was Vaughan Williams, Hellstone, Coleridge Taylor, and indeed these two others, a very young John Ireland and a less well-known figure, perhaps more associated with music in Australia, Fritz Hart. Now, actually, when Vaughan Williams arrived at the Royal College in 1892, he studied actually originally with Parry before going on to Cambridge for 3 years, where he studied history. And it was there that he did his university degree in music, which you can at that time only do actually externally. But when he came back from Cambridge in 1895, he spent 1 year with Stanford. And we have various reports from a little piece that Vaughan Williams wrote in the 1950s called A Musical Autobiography, many of impressions of which have rather stuck. And we have to realize, of course, Vaughan Williams was remembering Stanford almost 50, 60 years on from the time when he was a very young man. And he described the fact that Stanford, couldn't quite get the idea of modal harmony, even though Stanford himself was a master of modal harmony. He always felt that Vaughan Williams' music was a bit ugly, and he couldn't really understand why he wanted to write ugly music. How much of this is actually true, and how much one has to read between the lines, I don't know. But Vaughan Williams took a good deal of time as a composer to develop his style and his voice. And certainly, as compared with our two Croydon boys, Vaughan Williams and Holst certainly had to learn their harmony more thoroughly before they started to learn composition. And this was the case with Vaughan Williams. He had to go to the organist Gladstone to study harmony for the best part of 6 months before he was ready. And I think the same probably goes for Holst. And it's true to say that both of these composers, very much supported by Stanford, found their voices actually a good deal later. So while both of them left the college in the later 1890s, Vaughan Williams isn't really finding his absolute voice, his most personal voice, until, for example, the fantasy on a theme of Thomas Tallis. And perhaps for Holst, I would say that that's probably even later with the Planet Suite, which he writes during the First World War. But anyway, you imagine these young men at Wilkins drinking their coffee, talking about the latest music, whether it was, Wagnerian techniques or the emergence of Richard Strauss and so on, and what they thought about their teachers and, what was going right and what was going wrong. But they were really, a very good example of the sort of fruits that Stanford was bringing about as composition teacher at the Royal College. Then, of course, John Ireland appears. He's a young man from Manchester, and he starts to blossom in the early 20th century. And then very shortly after Ireland leaves the college, we have this figure on the right, this rather boyish-looking James Friskin. He's very little known nowadays as a composer, but the interesting thing is his name pops up again as the latter husband of Rebecca Clark, whose music does feature, of course, in this weekend's music. Now, Friskin produced several Cobbett works, again in the early 1900s. Stanford thought hugely highly of him, as he was technically very capable, but perhaps lacked that distinctiveness stylistically, which was, I think, the case with certainly Coleridge Taylor, Hellstone, Vaughan Williams, and Holst. The same could be said, I think, of the figure with a rather fabulous hat. This is Frank Bridge. We shall hear, as I say, his fantasy quartet 2 in the program. Now, Bridge started to study with Stanford in the very late 1890s. He would have been, again, on the edge of this Wilkins fraternity or salon. And again, he was hugely influenced by chamber music in his early creative life. Certainly in the first decade of the 20th century, when he was producing piano quintets and piano quartets and so on. He himself was an active viola player, a very good one, and indeed used to play from time to time with the Joachim Quartet when they came to London, or they needed a viola player if the viola player was absent. And I think Bridge himself always maintained that he was actually an unteachable pupil. Stanford himself remarked that he was quite difficult to teach. But I think what Stanford instilled in Bridge was a real feeling for form. Bridge's works have an absolutely almost watertight sense of intellectual balance and organicism. And undoubtedly, I think Stanford, who again excelled at this in his works like his string quartets, the two quintets, I think instilled in Bridge this sense of excellence and this idea of absolute music, this German idea that the only thing that really counts is the interrelationship of the notes themselves. No words, no other elements to influence form, only the notes themselves. And Bridge perhaps is one of Stanford's most brilliant intellectual composers. And I think Bridge acknowledged this towards the end of Stanford's life in the 1920s. If we move on, now on the right is the figure of Sir George Dyson, yet another Stanford pupil. He eventually became principal or director of the Royal College and saw the college through a very difficult period during the Second World War. But Dyson himself was a very able composer. He won the Mendelssohn Scholarship, a particular, scholarship at the Royal College that was offered to students who wanted to pursue their composing careers after they'd finished their time there. And Dyson said to Stanford, after he won the scholarship, well, Sir Charles, I suppose I ought to go to Leipzig, probably thinking of how Stanford himself had had a Leipzig education. And Stanford said to him, oh, no, my boy, you've done all of that. Go to Italy and sit in the sun. And that's precisely what Dyson did. And I think I think he learned to bring to his own orchestral music a certain opulence, which I think was partly influenced by his stay in Italy and also by his admiration for Richard Strauss. On the left, I've included this not because Percy Grainger, this blonde bombshell from Australia, who'd studied in Frankfurt in the late years of the 1890s. But Stanford was hugely impressed by this young man in the early 1900s who had settled in London, was making his name really as a virtuoso pianist, not so much as a composer at this time. But he befriended Stanford, and Stanford used to call him my polar bear. I'm not quite sure why, but he did, and he admired Grainger's brilliance as a virtuoso, and in 1905 produced his 3 Dante Rhapsodies for piano. By the same token, Grainger produced arrangements of some of Stanford's Irish dances in some of the most impossible keys. I seem to remember Stanford's first Irish dance in F major, and Grainger rearranged it in F sharp major, just really a sort of one-upmanship. But he greatly admired Stanford's work, of course, in arranging the Irish traditional repertoire. And of course, Grainger eventually made his name as a composer in folk song arrangement in his own particularly inimitable way. But there was, I think, a rather interesting chemistry between Grainger and Stanford. We look at a few other pupils that Stanford taught. And I should, by the way, just add that Grainger's arrangement of Brig Fair also features in this weekend's programme. which is rather fine, as does Vaughan Williams' arrangement of the Turtle Dove. Here we have three other composers who were pupils of Stanford. Muriel Herbert, we shall hear some of her songs this weekend. She studied with Stanford during the First World War, around 1916, 1917, principally a composer of songs, but some of them rather beautiful. She later, I think, was supported by Roger Quilter, who had been, interestingly, a sort of confederate of Percy Grainger in Frankfurt in the late 1890s. We have Henry Walford Davies. He wrote quite a lot of chamber music in the 1880s and 1890s, and later became organist at the various churches in London, great exponent of Bach. And Edgar Bainton, who is perhaps better known for some of his church music these days, but he eventually became well known as a principal at the Sydney Conservatorium in Australia. Now, more in line with the festival repertoire we're going to be hearing in Galway is Rebecca Clark. And Rebecca Clark is well known. She was one of Stanford's very first women composers. She'd had a difficult time, actually, partly because of her father's influence and so on, actually undergoing any kind of sustained musical education at all. But it was Stanford, actually, because Rebecca Clark was a very capable violinist, directed her towards the viola. Said, why don't you play the viola? You've probably got, decent-sized hands and so on. Why don't you switch to the viola? In fact, you could even make your career as a viola player, because, there's actually a growing repertoire for this music, which, of course, included Stanford's clarinet sonata, which can be played on the viola very satisfactorily. So Stanford had very much an influence, I think, on her performing career. But it was really through Stanford that she studied composition, and she started to make a name for herself, particularly after the First World War, with her works, including the viola sonata, which we shall hear this weekend. There's a rather nice story connected with Rebecca Clark and Cecil Forsyth, whom she knew in America. By the way, I should add that, of course, it was actually at the Juilliard School, where she later taught, that she met James Friskin, and they married rather late in life. But Cecil Forsyth, whom she also knew in New York, he was a rather interesting commentator on Rebecca Clark's education. And apparently it was so that she, after doing 1 year with Stanford at the Royal College, her father was actually militating against any further education, any further time, any further provision of money, which was rather badly needed. So Rebecca Clark went to Parry and said, well, I think I'm going to have to give up my musical education. I think Stanford and Parry were both very much against this. So Parry himself volunteered to say, well, would you mind if I paid for your fees? And of course, very much honoured by this statement, she said, Sir Hubert, I couldn't possibly dream of doing this. So Parry's reaction was, well, look, we've got funds for this kind of thing in the college. Would you mind if we took some funds from that instead? And when, of course, Rebecca Clark told Cecil Forsyth in this many years later in New York, Forsyth said, oh, you didn't buy into that, did you? He said, well, Parry paid for it just the same. Now, as a result of many of these pupils that Stanford taught, in 1911, he produced, if you like, a compendium, an anthology of those experiences over many years. And this work, musical composition, is in many ways seminal. A short treatise for students. It's published by Macmillan. This is in a later edition of 1912. But many composers have said that this, in many ways, was their musical Bible when they were learning composition. I mean, composers such as Michael Tippett, even Arthur Bliss, and so on, all maintained that really it was this work and the succinctness of Stanford's thoughts about how actually to compose. All of those things, all of those maxims that he expressed to his students during his lessons were in many ways articulated in this book. And I would maintain probably that it was probably the most important book of its type in the English language, certainly in English language teaching institutions, probably for the first half of the 20th century. And in fact, when you go through the pages, you learn so much, not only about how Stanford taught and the kinds of principles which guided his students, but also we learn a great deal about him as a composer, in particular things about chamber music and songs and fantasy movements. I would just finish by saying, of course, that some of the composers who actually aren't featuring in this weekend's festival, but also I think give an idea of just the preeminence of Stanford as a composition teacher, gives you an idea that this quality continued right the way through until the beginning of the First World War. You can see perhaps on the right at the bottom, this is a young Eugene Goossens of the famous Goossens family. He studied composition with Stanford around about 1909, 1910, 1911. Eventually became, well, he remained an eminent composer, but also became an eminent conductor, giving first performances of the things like The Rite of Spring in London and so on. A very important figure. We have just above him in uniform, the Gloucester, 2nd and 5th Gloucesters, Ivor Gurney, probably Stanford's most unteachable student, but whom Stanford himself maintained was one of his most brilliant. He was there at the Royal College in the years just before the First World War, alongside the composer you can see just to the left of him. This is a rather well-dressed Herbert Howells. Howells always Howells always used to say that Stanford called him his son in music, in the sense that perhaps Howells was probably one of his most brilliant. Although if I was to hold up, on 5 fingers, I would say probably Coleridge Taylor, Hellstone, Charles Wood, and I would think probably Herbert Howells were altogether probably the best of his pupils, or the most brilliant at the time, although some of them developed in different ways. One composer who certainly took some time to develop after not really enjoying his lessons with Stanford was on the left there. That's Sir Arthur Bliss, or a young Arthur Bliss, I think just after the First World War, in which he participated. It's interesting that Bliss always said that he didn't find his lessons with Stanford particularly conducive to creativity. And yet, when he himself became a teacher at the Royal Academy in the 1950s, he found himself echoing all the maxims of Stanford from musical composition. And it's very interesting to read the two alongside each other, just how much they match up in terms of their principles and imperatives for the young composer to learn. So many of these composers, I say, will feature in the festival in Galway this weekend. And I think what one should perhaps at least glean from this is that, yes, Stanford undoubtedly should be credited, perhaps uniquely, with the production of this extraordinary set of generations of creativity, that they all learned how to be individuals. They all learned from Stanford in various ways. Stanford himself, in fact, wanted to be the instigator of what he called a school of English composition. And in some ways, I think he felt that he'd never done this, or that he hadn't produced a generation that was in some way uniform in its style. And, you know, he was rather shocked when some of his later pupils started to embrace composers like Debussy and Richard Strauss and so on. And yet it was somebody like Dyson who said that what Stanford did perhaps more successfully than almost any other composer, any other teacher and composer, was to instill a sense of revolution. And once you've instilled that, in fact, you know, that's when you're going to get composers to express their individuality more readily. But that aside, I think what we learn is that it was precisely because of Stanford's own brilliance as a composer, and that's something that I think we need to remember and appreciate most in this weekend of programs. It was through Stanford's own brilliance that this extraordinary generation or set of generations of composers